All right, Jim. Well, let's get another question here. Let's see if you can keep making people think you're trying. This one was sent to
It
CornyDriveThru
may be an uphill struggle now.
CornyDriveThru@gmail.com. This was sent by Jose O. from the Goose.
What?
Whatever that may be. He's from the Goose. VEGOOSE. It's either a band or a locale.
I thought you said from the Goose.
I'm currently watching an old interview with Dusty Rhodes from 1999. And on the topic of him working in WWF in 1991, Dusty admits that he was at one point trying to see if he could take Pat Patterson's place as Vince's right hand. Second booker, he referred to it as. Do you think this would have worked? Would Dusty have elevated WWE going forward, or would two strong personalities clash too hard, a la Paul Heyman and Vince McMahon, and it end in bloody ruin?
Shambolic.
So the idea in 91, Dusty goes back to book for WCW. That's when he called you, obviously. What if he didn't do that? What if he stayed with WWF, retired from an in-ring role, and replaced Pat Patterson, who for one reason or another wouldn't be there? Would it have worked, him and Vince?
Him and Vince wouldn't have worked. Dusty could have booked the WWF and I think done wonderful things with it, but not with Vince around. Same reason at Watts for that brief 2 months or 6 weeks or whatever. You could see that he was starting to do some things that were, because it was dreary at that point, 94, early 95. But Vince wouldn't leave it. He wouldn't let anybody else be the booker. They had to be his assistant. And that's when Watts left. He said, Vince, there's only room for one Titan in Titan Sports. So I'm going home. With Pat, he didn't mind being the idea guy. He didn't mind being the second in command. He didn't mind being, Vince's guy to go to for in-ring stuff, but Vince had the final call. Dusty was a Sylvester Stallone. He was a writer, director, actor.
Mumble mouth.
He would have wanted more pull and more control over the roster and what they did and the product because he put so much of himself into it, and I could identify with it, that if it was good or bad or indifferent, he wanted it to be his. So whereas Pat was comfortable working in that spot and being Vince's right-hand guy, but not being responsible for the whole thing, I don't think it would have worked with Dusty and Vince just any more than it worked with Watts and Vince. It just wasn't going to work with Vince giving any kind of final say-so on anything to anybody.
That was kind of one of the big tests, too, when Dusty went back, and it worked out, and we all liked Dustin, but that was one of the things about Dustin. Dustin kind of took the place of Dusty on the roster in a way. But Dusty wasn't booking himself. Previously, when you were there with him, he was booking himself. I guess that was a bit of a transition, the idea that you're the booker and you're no longer... Because he never came back. I always expected it as a kid, as a fan. I was like, oh, Dusty Rhodes is there on commentary with Jim Ross. I just saw him wrestle a couple months ago. Surely he'll be in a match sometime, and it never happened.
I don't know. Probably part of the deal he made to come back was he'd focus on booking and not be in the ring because...
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
That was part of the problem the previous time is that a lot of guys said, well, Dusty won't get off the card and get out of the way. Well, by that point, though, it wasn't as wasn't as hard to talk Dusty into it because he was 5 or 6 years older or whatever. And he could see that, time waits for no man. So, but again, with even the same thing in the WWF, even without Dusty being in the ring and just being in the office and on creative, at that point in time, now later on, years later, when Dusty was in NXT and that was a whole different kettle of fish than being the booker for the guy that owns the whole thing. And that way he could just sit down there in Florida and talk to the boys and girls. And one of the guys said one time, Dusty was just sitting there, he said, Out of the blue, he said, Vince McMahon better be glad I didn't save my money. And that's why he was there in NXT.
Because that would change everything, I've got $5 more.
If he'd have saved all of that money, he wouldn't have been fucking sitting around at that arena probably at that point in time.